So today we're going to continue on our series on Baal. This is part of our overall look at Return of the Nephilim. And we're going to begin the day in 2 Kings chapter 1. I'm going to read verses 1 through 6 and verse 16. Then Moab is a descendant of Lot, which is going to be important in end times prophecy. But Moab rebelled against Israel after the death of Ahab, and Ahaziah, who's the son of Ahab and Jezebel, fell down through a lattice in his upper chamber that was in Samaria and was sick. He was injured. And he sent messengers and said unto them, Go, inquire of Beelzebub, the god of Ekron, whether I shall recover of this disease. But the angel of the Lord said to Elijah the Tishbite, Arise and go up to meet the messengers of the king of Samaria, and say unto them, Is it not because there is not a God in Israel that you go to inquire of Beelzebub, the god of Ekron? Now therefore, thus saith the Lord, Thou shalt not come down from that bed on which thou art gone up, but shalt surely die. And Elijah departed, and when the messengers turned back unto him, he said unto them, Why are you now turned back? And they said unto him, There came a man up to meet us, and said unto us, Go, turn again to the king that sent you, and say unto him, Thus saith the Lord, Is it not because there is not a God in Israel, that thou sendest to inquire Beelzebub, the god of Ekron? Therefore thou shalt not come down from that bed on which thou art gone up, but shalt surely die. And he said unto him, Thus saith the Lord, Forasmuch as thou hast sent messengers to inquire Beelzebub, the god of Ekron, is it not because there is no God in Israel to inquire of his word? Therefore thou shalt not come down off that bed on which thou art gone up, but shalt surely die. So this passage shows just what kind of influence you may have on your children. Now, although Jezebel and Ahab had been punished for their unrighteousness, their sons still turned to Baal instead of turning to Yahweh. And this is a warning on many different levels. Many people equate Baal with Satan, but that is not exactly correct, nor is it exactly wrong. In ancient Israel, they taught two Yahwehs, an earthly Yahweh and a heavenly Yahweh. Also, many Jews believed in a Holy Spirit, so when Jesus came, they had no problem accepting a Trinitarian view. It wasn't something that was new and novel to them, it's something they'd heard. Well, God creates and Satan imitates. And just as the word God is a title and not a name, the same is true of Satan. Satan simply means the accuser. And that's why there is confusion among many, or even most people, when they read about Satan in the Bible. And just as when I say God, you know that I'm referring to the creator of the universe, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which makes the term God equivalent to a name, the same is true of Satan. The word itself, like I said, means adversary. But there are 8 Satans in the Bible that I'm aware of. There may be more, but I could find 8 on a pretty quick search. One of those is the angel of the Lord, and another one is King David. They were adversaries of Balaam and the Philistines, respectively. However, Satan is a title for adversary. However, the word Satan came to be used as a name for the supreme adversary, whom we simply call Satan, and you should know to whom I'm referring when I use that as a name. So it is a title. We use it as a name. If I just say Satan, you know who I'm talking about. If I say God, you know who I'm talking about. But to understand this entire concept, we need to understand dualism. And to understand dualism, we need to define what we mean by the term dualism. Now, in many theological circles, and not necessarily sound theology, but in many theological circles, the term dualism is referred to the belief that there are two ultimate powers running the world, one of which is good and one of which is evil. And in what they're teaching, they present that good and evil coexist eternally, and that's built into the very nature of things. This would be called a metaphysical dualism. Jeffrey D'Souza says, Our world looks at the physical, and yet we know that it was the result of a force beyond physics. This is the literal meaning of the term metaphysics, which is after or beyond physics. In other words, it's concerned with what is ultimately real beyond what we can experience on this plane of existence. Quantum physics and metaphysics seem to have a lot of overlap. But what this means is that in modern theological use of metaphysical dualism, they are contending that ultimate reality is both good and evil, and that both have always existed, and therefore Satan, like God, is an eternal being who has always been in existence. Now, this goes directly against what the Bible teaches, and it seems to be a way of getting around the ultimate deity of God in the Bible. People who don't like God, they like this concept. But this idea is not consistent either biblically or philosophically because it contains a contradiction and it denies the Bible's claim of creation and ending of history eventually. So, in our sense in this study, when we're studying the dualism of the nature of Satan, we are looking at the nature that's both heavenly and earthly. And we see this heavenly activity in the book of Job. Satan, as a name, not a title, is a created being. He's superhuman, he's evil, he's a world power, he's an adversary of both God and man, and he's also personal. He's not simply some kind of mystical force. And while the God of the Bible is immutable, omnipotent, omniscient, immaterial, perfectly good, and necessary to existence, he is also a personal God. And he gives both human beings and angels free will. So when looking at Baal, we're looking at the earthly manifestation of Satan. Baal, by whatever name you want to call him, is both the son and the husband of Astarte. He's the son of Astarte with El, who's the chief false god. He also married Astarte, and whatever name she's called by. This is daytime soap opera material if I've ever heard it. In our opening passage, why is the god of Ekron called Beelzebub and not simply Baal? Now, you may be aware that it's a play on words, but we're going to take a look at that play on words and how it applied to those in Israel when Jesus walked the earth and how it applies to us today. Now, one thing to keep in mind is there's not a consistent spelling of the name in English. It's a transliteration, and Baal, B-A-A-L, is usually has an apostrophe in the middle of it, not always, and sometimes it's B-E-E-L or B-E-L. But the word itself simply means Lord or Master. In Babylon, Bel was short for Bel Marduk. Marduk was the main god in Babylon at the time of Daniel. In Jeremiah chapter 50, verse 2 says, Declare ye among the nations, and publish and set up a standard. Publish and conceal not. Say, Babylon is taken, Bel is confounded, Merodach, which is Marduk, is broken in pieces. Her idols are confounded, her images are broken in pieces. So Jeremiah associates Babylon with Bel. Now, if you read the book of Bel and the Dragon in the Apocrypha, Bel is Baal, and it shows how Daniel very skillfully and tactfully, you have to remember, Daniel was a politician. He had to be tactful, but he showed the king how he was being deceived by the religious elites. They were using the required sacrifice for themselves, and they were being deceitful about it, which sounds like many Christian congregations today. They're deceiving many, and eventually they're going to be exposed, and they may not be exposed very tactfully. In the story of Bel and the dragon, Daniel sprinkled dust on the floor so that the footprints of the deceivers were obvious in the morning. When they snuck in to get the sacrifice, you can see where they walked in and they walked out. And I think Jesus, at least metaphorically speaking, he sprinkled the dust with the words that he used in the Bible, that he used when he was teaching, that one day is going to expose the deceptions of the religious elites in our Christian institutions. Now, the title Lord of the Flies is not intended to be an insulting name, although the Jews came to use it in an insulting way. It was derived by the Philistines who combined the word Lord with Zavuv, which is flies. It was a cult of flies that feasted on excrement and they were viewed as pests. Now, these cults are also mentioned in the Greek world in relation to Zeus, among others. The texts of the ancient world depicted Baal as expelling flies, which are the cause of a person's sickness, at least to their belief. The name could also be rendered as Lord of the Dung. And this is why Ahaziah sent inquiring of Beelzebub in 2 Kings. It was a therapeutic belief. He was sick, and he wanted this false god to expel the flies to cure a sickness. So why did he not inquire of the God of Israel? God's not a wish machine in which you plunk in your sacrifice and you get immediate gratification. Often the deceiver, Baal, will do exactly that. You pray or you sacrifice to Baal, you sacrifice to the deceiver. I'll make you rich. I'll make you famous. I'll make you irresistible to women, or whatever you pray for and sacrifice for could be yours right now. It's sort of a prosperity gospel. The deception is that the immediate gratification could have eternal consequences because that's not the way God expects us to act generally. Now, he does still perform miracles and he does answer prayers, but sometimes the answer may be no or it may be later. Ahaziah cannot wait. He had to see now. He's like, I've got to know right now. But there's also a play on words here in which the name Beelzebul, which is Lord of the heavenly dwelling, was rendered as Beelzebub in a derogatory manner. But understanding the meaning of the name is key to understanding several New Testament passages. And sometimes these understandings take effort, it takes study. Uh, Especially at least in modern English speaking people, because it's rendered in a different language, but it's rendered in a different culture from what we're used to. The people Jesus was speaking to would have understood this play on words without thinking about it. We have to study. One of the dad jokes that I tell periodically is that I once lost my job as an elevator repairman because I couldn't get a lift to work. Now, it's a play on words in English, but the British context is that a lift is an elevator. But getting a lift to work is an American term that means getting a ride to work. So I couldn't get a lift to work has a double meaning due to the play on words. And this play on words does not make sense to somebody who doesn't speak English or if they're not familiar with both the American and the British context of that phrase. So these plays on words in the Bible were things that would have been easily understood by them, but not easily understood by us. The Testament of Solomon describes him as Beelzebul, not Beelzebub. That's a positive term. But the Testament of Solomon should in no way be considered as scripture, nor is it one of the biblically approved extra biblical works such as First Enoch, Jasher, things like that. It is a false gospel. It seems to have been written between the 1st and 5th century AD, which is about 1500 years after Solomon died, but it wasn't finalized until the Middle Ages. It's very popular among Gnostic circles. It purports to be an autobiography of King Solomon, but it's not. It shows how he used demons to build the temple and things like that. It's a false gospel, but it does confirm the common belief in the association between Baal and Lucifer. That was a cultural context. Now, Beelzebub is also associated with gluttony, and gluttony has to do with an overindulgence of anything, not just food. We tend to think of it just as food, but it's an overindulgence of anything. Therefore, his presence is invoked in many situations of overindulgence and in situations in which they want immediate gratification that ignores future consequences. And how fitting that's going to be, or how fitting it has been in his return to the modern world, that this gluttony is part of what he represents. Now, Beelzebub was either a fallen angel or a Nephilim who rebelled against Satan, but he was not always at war with Satan. But he was never a good guy. His rebellion was just a different form of evil. Now, if we want to understand the New Testament lessons and the plays on words, we have to try to understand the Old Testament from the ancient Jewish context. He is Lord of the flies. In America, when we hear of flies, we tend to think of the common housefly. Now, while houseflies do carry some risk of carrying diseases, they're mostly just a pest. They're kind of irritating. Ironically, it's been discovered that they actually clean up antibiotics from factory farms, so they actually have a beneficial use. Factory farms use a lot of antibiotics to create healthier and bigger animals, but they're passed through into the fecal matter, and when that is used as fertilizer, it gets into the soil, and then those antibiotics get into the plants that we consume. Well, houseflies reduce this. However, in the Middle East, they don't have pestilences of houseflies, but they have pestilences of drain flies. This is We're going to see why this is important shortly, so bear with me on this. But this is a family of insects called Psychodidae. They're true flies, but they resemble moths. As a matter of fact, one of the names they're known as is a moth fly, but they are true flies. They're also known as sink flies, sewer flies, and other names. They're found primarily in tropical areas and swamps, but also they thrive in a sludge-based environment such as drains, sewers, or manure piles. Now, some species feed on blood, and they're known as sandflies in some countries, which are not to be confused with horseflies, which are big, nasty, biting animals that we have around here, or no-see-ums, which we also have around here. But these are also called sandflies in some countries. This is not the same thing as what the blood-eating drain flies are called as sandflies. So the larvae of these flies, they attach themselves to the walls of their environment and they remain firmly planted. Adult drain flies live for about 20 days and they breed once, laying between 30 and 100 eggs. The eggs hatch in about 48 hours. The larval stage lasts 9 to 15 days. The pupal stage lasts 20 to 40 hours, and now you have more adults all living in the exact same environment. Normally, they will multiply in their environment, but they will also take advantage of opportunistic uh, myiasis. What that is that's breeding in living tissue, but they only do it when it's open wounds. Some animals, they actually lay eggs in healthy skin, like bot flies, blowflies, screw flies, things like that. But drain flies, they take advantage of existing open wounds, but they don't actively do that. They stay where they are. And most species of brain flies are between 2 and 2.5 millimeters. They're covered in tiny little hairs like moths are. And one thing they do when they outgrow in their environment is they drain pipes, or they clog pipes. They clog drain pipes. So how is this used in the New Testament? Well, there's a literal usage, but there's also a play on words that we're going to look at. The play on words would have been obvious to a contemporary listener of Jesus, but not so much to us. Mark chapter 3, verse 22. And the scribes which came down from Jerusalem said, He hath Beelzebub. It means that he is possessed by Beelzebub, and by the prince of devils casteth he out devils. So the scribes are making two different accusations against Jesus. This is not one accusation. The Matthew account says it's the Pharisees making the accusations. Matthew focuses on the Jewish aspect of the story, but Mark focuses upon the action. So the scribes and Pharisees work together. The Matthew is all talk. Mark is all action. Mark is like a shooting script for a movie. Go, 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 go. Next scene, next scene, next scene. Luke, who is writing 20 years later, he based his writings on interviews with those who witnessed the actual events, and it says that some of them said. So one account focuses on the Pharisees, one focuses on the scribes, and Luke says some of them said. Matthew chapter 12, verses 25 through 28. And Jesus knew their thoughts and said unto them, Every kingdom divided against itself is brought to desolation, and every city or house divided against itself shall not stand. And if Satan casts out Satan, he is divided against himself. How shall then his kingdom stand? And if I by Beelzebub cast out devils, by whom do your sons cast them out? Therefore they shall be your judges. But if I cast out devils by the Spirit of God, then the kingdom of God is come unto you. Notice it in this scene, the ones who were making these accusations, they didn't really seem to be surprised at somebody casting out demons. They just questioned the person that was doing them. Now, I've heard many people say that casting out demons was something new because it's not mentioned in the Old Testament. It is not. However, in this accusation, the scribes and Pharisees didn't say, Hey, what are you doing there? No, they implied that he was using the power of Satan to do so. But their sons are implied to have been casting them out quite regularly. This is not something new. But Jesus knew their thoughts and pointed out that Satan cannot be divided against Satan. Now, Beelzebub is high in the hierarchy of the unseen realm of the fallen angels. In some teachings, the top three are Lucifer, Leviathan, and Beelzebub. Some place him as Beelzebub, Lucifer, and Astaroth, or Astarte. And I'm not sure that these are in opposition to one another. May just be different representations of the same thing. But like I said, Beelzebub is associated with gluttony, but he's also associated with envy, pride, and he's known as the god of idolatry. And the Pharisees accused Jesus of using Beelzebub's demonic power to heal people. So, this entity who has possessed many people throughout the centuries, he doesn't cast out demons and heal people. He possesses them, he doesn't dispossess them. Uh, Beelzebub is accused of possessing Sister Madeline de Nemendolz, who, through her relationship with Father Jean Baptiste Gaufridi, led to countless traumatic events in the hands of her inquisitors, but also led to the torture and execution of Gaufridi himself. She was possessed by Beelzebub. And this is probably the most infamous possession of somebody in modern history. This is during the Inquisitions. But there were others, such as at the Salem witch trials, and Cotton Mather also wrote about Beelzebub's influence as well. But the Pharisees said that this demonic entity was casting out demons. Now, my assumption, based on the evidence, is that these Pharisees, they were the religious elites and they didn't want anybody cutting into their income, which means their sons were probably charging money for it and they were taking a cut of it. That's an assumption. That's not stated. But the Pharisees, they used the title to equate calling something a pile of excrement and comparing his followers to flies, drain flies in particular. 2 Kings 10:7. And they break down the image of Baal and cast down the house of Baal and made it a draft house unto this day. In the Septuagint, the Greek word latronis is used for draft house. What does that sound like? Sounds kind of like latrine, right? The NET Bible says they demolished the sacred pillar of Baal and the temple of Baal, and it is used as a latrine to this very day. So the word draft house means a latrine, a privy. They pulled down the sacred pillar in the temple and they turned it into an outhouse. The Greek word that was used is an idiom. The literal meaning of the Greek word in the Septuagint has to do with being set free or released from an obligation, but the Hebrew has to do with a sewer, a cesspool, or a cloaca. It's the refuse dump. Isaiah 45:13. I have raised him up in righteousness, and I will direct all his ways. He shall build my city, and he shall let go my captives, not for price nor reward, says the Lord of hosts. That's the same word. In the Septuagint, this word price is the same word that's translated as latrine elsewhere. The word literally has to do with a pay for work, has to do with a hireling, an adoration given based upon attributes, what we call worship. And it's unclear why this is translated as latrine in one place, which is not its usual definition, and is used as ransom or pay elsewhere, which is the usual definition. However, in both cases, something is released, but they're opposites. In languages, many words that have to do with latrines, they start as euphemisms for polite company. It's a polite way of saying something that you don't want to say. You may need to be made privy to the necessary information on latrines. Privy and necessary are both the words for it. Draft house that we just looked at is another example. Matthew 15:17. Do you not understand that whatsoever entereth in at the mouth goeth into the belly and is cast out into the draught? In this passage, Jesus makes a distinction between the belly and the heart by using the word for understand that doesn't have a negative connotation. There's another word for understand that does have a negative connotation. This one doesn't. This literally says, perceive you not. We're expected to use our intellect. We're expected to use our minds for insight into the things of God. We don't use our intellect for pride, but for understanding. Our minds, they don't work infallibly. And the older we get, the less infallible they are. But we should use them because that's what God intended. That's why God gave us a brain. That's why He gave us a mind. Intellectual laziness is not a credit to righteous living. I've seen people just say, oh, I'm just going to follow with whatever is said. No, God expects us to use our minds. This is why the Bible tells us that study is the highest form of worship. That's why we're having these meetings here. We're studying the words of God. Now, this word that's translated as a euphemism for toilet is different than the word that's used in the Septuagint that we looked at. It's the word aphedron, which is from the word for seat and away from, is in a separating distance. Kind of fitting. But the word that's translated as goeth is the Greek word zoreo, and it means something that goes in and pushes out whatever is there and makes way to what is coming in. In other words, it has to make space. In the NET Bible, don't you understand that whatever goes into the mouth enters the stomach and then passes into the sewer? Matthew 19:11, but he said unto them, all cannot receive this saying, save to whom it's given. This word translated as saying has to do with reasoning. It's not simply a soundbite that you remember a motto or something like that. It has to do with reasoning, something that you think about. And this word receive, this is our word zoreo. Not all can move reasoning out. If they have a reasoning in their mind, they can't always move it out in order to make room for new reasoning. This is human reasoning. Oh, this is what I already believe and I can't change my ways. So Jesus was making a direct appeal to the spiritual intelligence of the disciples to not misconceive what he was saying. Move your false beliefs out to make room for true belief coming in. Today, look around. I mean, do you see religious groups misconceiving and misconstruing the words of Jesus? See it everywhere. And that's oppressive to people. Now, the Roman culture had many bathhouses. This is a public toilet. And this is the image that's being portrayed here in the New Testament. These were in populated areas such as in Ephesus, and the public toilet served not only to relieve one of physical needs, but to socialize, gossip, things like that. That's where we get the idiom latrine rumor for gossip that's passed along in the military latrine houses. This is not my idea of how I want my bathroom time to be spent, by the way, but it's the context that they used. In these bathhouses, sea sponges were used and they were shared, and they were called in Latin tessorium, which means wiping things, which comes from the Latin word tersus, which means clean, neat, wiped off, and from that we get the English word terse. Luke 7:44. And he turned to the woman and said unto Simon, seest thou this woman? I entered into thine house, thou gavest me no water for my feet, but she hath washed my feet with tears and wiped them with the hairs of her head. This word wiped is the same word tersit, from the same word. Now, back to our story, this is going to require a little bit of a paradigm shift here. Exodus 25:9. According to all that I show thee, after the pattern of the tabernacle and the pattern of the instruments thereof, even so shall you make it. Our English word paradigm comes from the Greek paradigma, which means pattern or example. In English, the word became popular in the 1960s due to a book written by Thomas Kuhn, who defined a paradigm shift as a radical change in the way that one thinks about and solves a problem. A paradigm shift involves new concepts and requires you to think outside the box. So when Moses came down from Mount Sinai, he had two things. Well, he had at least two things. We're told about two things. He may have had more, but we know he had two things. He had the tablets with the Ten Commandments, and he had the engineering blueprints for the tabernacle. In the Septuagint, the word for tabernacle is skune, which means tent, theater, or stage, and it's where we get the English word scene. Philippians 3:17, brethren, be followers together of me, and mark them which walk, so as ye have us for an ensample. This word ensample is from the Greek word tupos, which is an impression or a mark. It's literally what when you would take a stroke and you'd mark it in the clay to write down, like the tablets that had the Ten Commandments on it. These would be the marks that the finger would make, or a stylist would make. But in a passive sense, in a metaphorical sense, it came to be used to mean an example of something. The Hebrew idea of a type is called a remez, which is a hint of something deeper. In the Bible, it's something that's usually in the Old Testament that represents something about Jesus in the New Testament. It may also have future prophetic implications as well. Some types are stated to be type. This is an example. This is a type. Other types are inferred. You know about reading the story and you know what happens later. For example, Saul and David are types of Satan and Jesus, although it's not stated explicitly. In 66 AD, the Roman general Vespasian was dispatched to put down the Jewish revolt that was taking place. In 69 AD, he became emperor, replacing Nero, and his son Titus finished the military action in Jerusalem, which resulted in the destruction of the Jewish temple Jesus had prophesied about 40 years previously. Interestingly, it should be noted that when he was taking over Jerusalem, that he had commanded his soldiers to not destroy the temple. But somebody set it on fire. Probably some soldiers got tired of the fighting and they wanted to end it so they could go home. But Josephus reports that Titus fell to his knees out in public and he wailed, "With God as my witness, I declared the temple to not be destroyed." He wanted to preserve the temple and its beauty as a trophy. God wanted it destroyed. Jesus had prophesied its destruction. It was going to happen. As a side note to our discussion here that we're talking about latrines and talking about Vespasian, Vespasian is credited with one invention, and that's pay toilets. More precisely, it was a urine tax on public toilets because urine would turn to ammonia in short order and it was used to clean clothes. A politician will never miss an opportunity to tax anything they can. He was first and foremost a bureaucrat. He was a general, but he was a bureaucrat. And bureaucrats think along the lines that if something can be measured, it can be taxed. All you have to do is monitor and control the production and distribution sites, and it's never recorded that Jesus paid a single tax. When it was demanded that he pay the temple tax, Peter, who's a fisherman, he caught a fish, and there just happened to be 2 coins in there. It just happened is in quotation marks because nothing happens coincidentally. We're going to look at that event a little more closely at some point in the future. But some things are easy to monitor and tax, such as alcoholic beverages. Some things are hard to monitor, such as yard sales, although there are jurisdictions where they do collect sales tax at yard sales. And every tax, if too burdensome, will create a black market, such as moonshiners with alcoholic beverages. But there's a Latin phrase, pecunia non ole, which means money does not stink. This phrase has its roots with the actions of Vespasian taxing public toilets. Some people say, "I love the smell of money." 1 Timothy 6:10 says, "For the love of money is the root of all evil, all sorts of evil, which while some coveted after, they have erred from the faith and pierced themselves through with many sorrows." So this brings to mind Ephesians 6:12 again. But it's not just the secular government that loves money, it's also the religious government, the religious elites, the temple tax. You're not tithing enough. It doesn't matter if they're in the church or outside the church, they're all worldly leaders. Mark chapter 7, verses 18 through 19. And he saith unto them, "Are you so without understanding also? Do you not perceive that whatsoever thing from without entereth into the man, it cannot defile him? Because it entereth not into his heart, but into the belly, and goeth out into the draught, purging all meats?" In this passage, Mark took the figurative meaning of latrine and he forced it to include the literal meaning. This word that Jesus uses for latrine, the aphidrona, and the Greek word euponymous are both used as in an inscription that was found by archaeologists at Pergamum, which is one of the 7 churches in Revelation to which Jesus dictated letters to John. The inscription is broken, so we don't have the whole thing, But it says, and this is a translation of it, it says, concerning public toilets, the town clerk shall maintain the public toilets and their sewer outpipes, and if some of them are not covered and of them, then they don't have the rest of it. So both of these words are used in one context here. Romans 6:14 says, for sin shall not have dominion over you, for you're not under the law, but you're under grace. And the word "thee" is not there with the law, for you're not under law, is all it says. Paul often writes about being under law. However, it's important that there's no article here. This article was added by translators to clarify things. And when they clarify things, sometimes it makes things even more obscured. It simply says, for you're not under law. And it's necessary to distinguish between the law, which is the glory and opinion of God, and law, which is opinion and glory of man or human beings. And we're not going there now, but I would recommend reading Luke 18, verses 1 through 8 in this context. But the law comes from God, law is made by man. James 2:9. But if you have respect to persons, you commit sin and are convinced of the law as transgressors. This is talking about partiality. And many people say, oh, you shouldn't let somebody off just because they're rich. Well, how about letting somebody off just because they're poor? It says respect to persons, not respect to the wealthy. If you show respect to persons, you're working a sin. It's not an inconsequential matter. If you do this, you're convicted or exposed as a transgressor. We're all equal. The word for law is related to the word for pasture, nomad, and coin. The progression of the word seems to be from a pasture to a distribution of sheep, to the rules for the distribution of sheep, to representations of wealth such as coins. The verb form is nemo, and the noun form is nomos, and can mean either pasture or custom or law, depending upon where you put the accent on the word. In English, words such as economy, astronomy, numismatics, and other words, they're all related to the same Greek word. Ancient Greek was written in all uppercase letters and had no spaces. The meaning was conveyed by the sounds that were made when the text was read. As sounds changed, the writing changed along with it, and that's the cause of many of the textual differences in ancient manuscripts. Hebrew, however, is different because there's no explicit vowels in Hebrew, there's only consonants. So the words are made from combining consonants with different meanings, and words could take on a range of meanings. You might have like a primary meaning, but you might have this whole bubble that contains the different ideas that should come into your head when you're thinking about the primary meaning. Now, because Greek was phonetically based, Paul was able to use a lot of puns, double meanings, allusions, connections with local cultures, connections with the Septuagint, and things such as that. Jesus also used a lot of plays on words in order to conceal his message from those who didn't have ears to hear, but his plays on words were of a different style than Paul's for the most part. So Romans 6:14 says, for sin shall not have dominion over you, for you're not under law, but under grace. In this passage, there is a play on words that depends on where you place the space in the text. And remember, the original had no spaces. The surface meaning that we see in the English translation is 100% true, and it's 100% correct, and it's 100% accurate, and it's 100% important. What you read on the surface on the translation is correct. However, the double meaning is also true, correct, accurate, and important. Both of these words are in the accusative, and the accents were added later, but with the space, it is uponomos, which means under law. Without the space, it is uponomos, one word, which is an underground passage, mine, water pipe, conduit, sewer, or a vein of minerals. So Paul seems to be saying two different things that are both true, they're both correct, they're both accurate, and they're both important. There may be more than two, but there's at least these two. First one is that on earth, you're not under law, but you're under grace from above. On earth, you're not sewer pipes, metaphorically speaking, but you're under purpose from above. Now, the word for grace is favor, and it can be translated as purpose. And grace is the power of Christ. So you can have favor from God, you can have purpose from God. Now, in Rome, there are catacombs. The catacombs are vast underground burial areas. And believe it or not, you can buy tickets today to visit them if you wish. But early Christians sometimes met there. It was a place that they could avoid persecution. They could get away from the eyes of those who wanted to shut them up and stop them. The idea of an underground conduit here may have a meaning in this context. I don't know that it does. It's within the realm of possibility on that. Now, the word catacomb comes into English through Latin from two Greek words, which is cata, which means under, and tumbos, which is a funeral mound or a tomb. And the Latin is literally catatumba, so catacomb. Matthew 5:14, you are the light of the world. A city that's set on a hill cannot be hid. If you're on a hill, you're not underground. You're not under law. But let's take a look at a few verses and decide how well the secondary meaning of sewer pipes as a conduit for earthly purpose fits or doesn't fit the verse. In some cases, the meaning of underground passage may actually fit better. Where we started, Romans 6:14, for sin shall not have dominion over you, for you're not under law, but under grace. You're under purpose. Romans 6:15, what then? Shall we sin because we're not under law, but under grace? God forbid. We're not under the sewer pipes. We're not under the law. 1 Corinthians 9:20, and unto the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might gain the Jews. To them that are under law, as under law, that I might gain them that are under law. This is one we should think about. To those who are under law, or those who are under sewer pipes, he became as under law, that he might gain them. I mean, that's down and dirty. That's what he was missionary to. Not everybody is called to do that, but if you're called to do that, you need to do it. I don't want you to fall short. I don't want to fall short myself. But this is serious stuff here. This is stuff we should be thinking about. Galatians 3:23. But before the faith came, we were kept under law, shut up unto the faith which should afterwards be revealed. And remember, under law can be under sewer pipes. It's not a pleasant thought. It's not a pleasant experience. But this verse has the faith that came. There's a definite article with the word faith there. This is the faith, but they were kept under law, not the law. Sometimes the article is implied, but if it were placed in the verse, and the play on words would not work. And then Galatians 4, verses 4 through 5. But when the fullness of time was come, God sent forth his Son, made of a woman, made under law, to redeem them that were under law, that we might receive the adoption of sons. Those who are under law are redeemed that we might become sons. This is subjective. The tense here is subjective. We might not become sons. A son is someone who's accepted as a mature child. It applies to women too, sons and daughters. In the Greek, the generic is masculine, just like it is in English properly. So, it applies to both men and women. But a son, a mature child, and the word that's translated as adoption is not the modern 20th and 21st century used in the United States and now in other nations as of being placed into a family in which one was not born. It didn't used to mean that in English, but it does now. But it meant son placement because you're accepted as a mature child. It's a position within the family and not a placement into the family. It's a Greek word, huiothesia, which is the exact same thing that is meant by bar mitzvah. Bar mitzvah is not where a child is put into a family he wasn't born. It's where he is an adult. And then the last one, Galatians 4:21. Tell me, ye that desire to be under law, do you not hear the law. In this verse, the first law doesn't have the article. It's under law. It's going to be the play on words for under the sewer pipes. The second law has a definite article. So what is the law? Matthew chapter 22, verses 36 through 40. Master, which is a great commandment in the law? Jesus said unto him, Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy mind. This is the first and great commandment. And the second is like unto it, that thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. How do you love your neighbor as yourself? And that's a topic that's worthy of lengthy rumination. We should think about it. We should discuss it. It's a great thing to sit around and talk about. How can we help our neighbors? How can we love our neighbors ourselves? Some of these thoughts would be biblical. Some would be philosophical and practical. But in this verse, love is a verb. It requires action. It requires that you have to do something. Galatians 5:18. But if you be led of the Spirit, you're not under law. Are you led of the Spirit? Then you're not under the law. You're not under the sewer pipes. So what does all this have to do with our subject of Baal? In our opening passage, Ahaziah called on the god of Ekron named Beelzebub. He was not simply Baal, because Baal is known by multiple names and titles. Beelzebub is a play on words. It literally means Lord of the flies, Lord of the drain flies, but came to mean Lord of the dung heaps. And like I said, these are not just any flies. These flies multiply uncontrolled in sewer pipes. They're underground conduits is where they live, and eventually they clog the pipes, and they just generally make life miserable for the people in the Middle East who have to deal with them. Those who make the laws of man, both the secular laws and the religious laws of man as to God's law, they're very burdensome, but they do the same thing metaphorically. They clog the pipes. Do you tithe enough? I need to see your W-2 to make sure that you're tithing enough. Are you wearing the right kind of clothing? Why didn't you wear a tie to church on Sunday? Are you going to the politically correct church, or are you going over there with those guys? Hey, you need to spend 20 hours a week in missions at least. And you have to do at least 10 houses per day door knocking. And you're all evangelists. These are all the man-made rules that are one size fits all, and most importantly, they're not biblical. If you're called to go door knocking, go door knocking. If you're not called to go door knocking, if you go door knocking, that's what the Bible calls lawlessness. Now, we've looked at some plays on words today between both the name or title Beelzebub and the phrase under law. Now, I promised my wife that we wouldn't go into politics too much, which we're going to go into it a little bit, but I will keep my promise of not too much. But a righteous life is inseparable from politics, mainly because politics wants to impose itself upon the righteousness in your life. This should be a very familiar verse by now. Ephesians 6:12. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, and against the worldly governors, the princes of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness which are in the high places. Baal will return, or he has returned, in the political realm, and not just secular government, but also in church government. There are many laws that we're under. Many of them are quite popular, but they clog up the pipes and cause an unpleasant situation. As Christians, we're obligated to follow the law of God, which is summed up in loving the Lord with all our hearts, minds, and soul, and loving our neighbors as ourselves. But how about the laws of man? Are we obligated to follow those? Are they oppressive? Do they violate the laws of God? And those are all questions that we should ask continuously. One day there will be a law requiring a mark, and unless the Lord takes us out of here by then, we're going to have to make it a choice to accept it or not. And even if he does take us out, we need to warn others. Will we follow that law? It's going to be a wildly popular law. People are going to be all in favor of it. Oh, man, this is great. Most of these laws are abominations. They protect men who want to destroy women in sports. They mutilate children. They celebrate abominable behaviors. They promote ungodly behavior. They punish righteousness. And while it's true the persecution in much of the world is mild compared to other parts, it's still happening. Protects laws that promote abortion. There are schemes that promote forced redistribution of wealth, such as socialism and Marxism. They failed every time for 4,000 years of written history, but let's try it one more time. We're just not doing it right. 4,000 years. That's one of the oldest writings we have is the failure of those sorts of schemes. There are laws that provide protection at the expense of liberty, laws that promote identity politics, and instead of uniting us as God's children, these laws divide us by race, sex, and whatever else these dark powers can do to gain control over the people. Divided, you can be conquered. These are all evil, and they're all popular, and that's because most people are blind. Matthew 15:41. And if the blind lead the blind, both shall fall into the ditch. Will we place ourselves under the laws of man? Will we follow the blind leaders? The goddess is here and promoting the environment that she wants. This is the environment of seduction and destruction, and it is where she thrives. And she's always preceded by the deceiver, who is both her son and her husband. She always betrays him, but he always returns for more. He enjoys the hedonism. The world enjoys the hedonism. But that's why the world is so easily deceived, because they want to be deceived. The deceiver will give you what you want, and he will give it to you right now. Hey, kid, want some candy? Come on, get in the van. I'll give you some candy. He'll give you power. He'll give you wealth. He'll give you whatever you want in order to get you to give him your autonomy. We're going to see transhumanism. We're already seeing transhumanism. We're seeing militant homosexuality, rioting, mass theft, the entire destabilization of society and destruction of all that is righteousness. The world tells us that good is evil and black is white. And this is just the beginning of the birth pangs. It's going to get worse.